It's the Happy Families podcast. It's the podcast for the time-poor parent who just wants answers now.
Britain's Telegraph detailed hundreds of word changes across the author's works, made by Dahl's publisher Puffin and the Roald Dahl story company since 2020. Omissions and additions related to weight, gender, race, and more.
And now here's the stars of our show, my mum and dad.
Hello, this is Dr. Justin Coulson, happyfamilies.com.au, dad to 6 kids, here with Kylie, wife, mum to those children. And Kylie, today a podcast, we were just going to mention this in our book club episode, which we've pushed back till next week because this is such a big topic. I thought we'd just slot it in here, but I think it deserves its own episode. And therefore, today's podcast conversation is about an issue that affects every single parent who loves to read to their kids, and that is that books are changing. Kylie.
So last year we actually talked about the fact that Dr. Seuss was under condemnation.
Yes.
Because in today's society, so much of what was written in there isn't acceptable anymore.
Yeah, so this came about, there was big news last year. I've gone and found an article that reminds us of it. There's an Edith Cowan University report. The lead author of the report is Helen Adam, and she's concerned that 6 of the 10 most popular kids' books in Australia have animal characters with no humans in them, decreasing the likelihood of children from minority backgrounds seeing characters similar to themselves. I mean, I always thought that you use the animal characters so that you can be inclusive and no child feels like they're not being included because they're boys or girls or because they're one racial background or another. So you use the animals because then it's just applicable to everyone, because everyone can be a bunny rabbit or a bear. And we're talking about kids.
Yeah.
And the reason we're having this conversation today, of course, is because the next one who is very much on the nose is Roald Dahl. Now, I'm going to say right up front, I don't actually like Roald Dahl books. I've never liked Roald Dahl books. I've always found him irreverent. Even when I was a kid, I didn't like him. I didn't like the way he spoke. I thought that he was just rude and horrible.
Well, it's funny. I probably feel the same way for lots of different reasons. But the kids recently were watching the latest rendition of Matilda, and I was absolutely floored at, I guess, I'm going to use the word abuse that was depicted of children by the matron. And especially in today's society and in the climate that we live in.
Confronting.
It was really, really confronting.
Let me ask you a question. I know you're going to make a point, but I want to ask you a question real quick. How do the kids feel about what they're seeing?
They loved it.
They loved it. They're singing the songs. They absolutely, they're hooked.
What they loved, though, was that Matilda stood up for herself. That's what they saw out of it.
And they get that it's fantasy. Like, they know it's not real. So Aussie bloke, Tim Minchin, he was the one who put the Matilda stuff together. Have a listen to these changes. Have a listen to these changes that the publisher, Puffin, have made to Roald Dahl's books. And there are many people who are calling this censorship. This is from Matilda. This is the 2001 edition. She went on olden day sailing ships with Joseph Conrad. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and to India with Rudyard Kipling. And then in the 2022 edition, they've changed it to she went to 19th century estates with Jane Austen. She went to Africa with Ernest Hemingway and California with John Steinbeck. Like they've just updated it. It's no longer relevant that Rudyard Kipling and Joseph, they're just not in there. Have a listen to this from The Witches. Even if she is working as a cashier in a supermarket or typing letters for a businessman, they've updated that in the 2022 edition to say, even if she is working as a top scientist or running a business. Because, well, you know where that's going. We're comparing, we've got a woman working as a cashier in a supermarket or typing letters for a businessman, and now she's a top scientist or running a business. And this one also from The Witches, 2001 versus 2022. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. You can't go around pulling the hair of every lady you meet, even if she is wearing gloves. Just you try it and see what happens. That's the old one. Here's the new one. Don't be foolish, my grandmother said. Besides, there are plenty of other reasons why women might wear wigs, and there is certainly nothing wrong with that. And so what we've got here is just this shift to be, I guess, more inclusive. They've gentlified. I don't know if that's clearly not a word, but they've made Roald Dahl a whole lot more gentle, a whole lot more passive.
But that's not who he was.
No.
And to do so actually destroys the integrity of the work as it was written.
So you want some hot takes?
Go for it.
Okay, Christopher Paolini says, as usual, George Orwell had the measure of our times. Here's a quote from George Orwell from 1984. Every record has been destroyed or falsified, every book rewritten, every picture has been repainted, every statue and street building has been renamed, every date has been altered, and the process is continuing day by day and minute by minute. History has stopped. Nothing exists except an endless present in which the party is always right. 1984 is such a great book. Here's another hot take for you. Michael Hobbs says this is going to be invoked as woke censorship for years to come, despite no one asking for it and the publisher receiving widespread criticism from the left. James Dreyfus says it's only a few words. What does it matter to you if it's more inclusive? I don't see what's wrong. Because of course you don't. This is setting a dangerous precedent and essentially giving the go-ahead for further purging of wrong right. Wait and see. Somebody else says, speaking as one of the folks that angry people often disparage as woke, I find the rewriting of Roald Dahl books to be insane. Read them or not. Talk to your kids about them or not. Let them go out of print or not. But don't rewrite an author's words. This is madness. And this person says changing not many years ago to many years ago is the most minor of the Roald Dahl edits, but it's the one that I can't stop thinking about. It's not even trying to fix something potentially offensive. It's just kids are too stupid to understand that a book was written in the past. And so we've got, the Twitter sphere has gone absolutely nuts about all of these changes that are occurring. Newspaper articles are going off across the world about all of it. And it kind of makes me want to go and buy all of his old books. I don't even like him, but I kind of want to just have all of those books for posterity, for our kids and our grandkids because of this. I think the reason kids loved Roald Dahl's stories is because the baddies were so gross and so disgusting and they got their comeuppances in gruesome and horrible ways, exquisitely described. And when we're censoring that for sensitivities, it fails to tap into what's going on with kids. I found this in The Guardian. The word fat has been cut from every new edition of the relevant books, while the word ugly has also been culled. Augustus Gloop in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory is now described as enormous. In the twits, Mrs. Twit is no longer ugly and beastly, but just beastly.
Because beastly's better than ugly.
In previous editions of James and the Giant Peach, the centipede sings, Aunt Sponge was terrifically fat and tremendously flabby at that, and Aunt Spiker was thin as a wire and dry as a bone, only drier. Both of those verses have been removed, and in their places are the rhymes, Aunt Sponge was a nasty old brute and deserved to be squashed by the fruit, and Aunt Spiker was much of the same and deserves half of the blame. Here's something else that's really interesting. References to female characters have disappeared. So Miss Trunchbull in Matilda was once a most formidable female and is now a most formidable woman. So even the word female has been taken out, and they've put a whole lot of gender-neutral terms in places where they never used to be. So in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory's Oompa Loompa situation where we had small men, they're now small people. The Cloud Men in James and the Giant Peach have become cloud people. We're just seeing this dilution of Roald Dahl's stories. And whether you like him or not, and whether he was even a nice guy or not, because I've heard and read over the years some awful things about the guy. It feels like it's just an over-the-top response. The moral outrage because we have to be sensitive. And I believe that we need to be sensitive. I believe that we should be appropriate. But the books were written 30, 40 years ago, 50, 60 years ago in some cases. I reckon it's worth having, as we wrap up the podcast, a short conversation, maybe a couple of minutes on what we should do about it as parents. Because we can sit on the podcast and we can whinge and whine and say, what's going on with the world? But we need to have a conversation about where to go and what to do with this. I came across a quote years and years ago. I just love this quote. It's a quote from L.P. Hartley in his 1953 novel, The Go-Between. And he says this, the past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And I love this idea of Hartley's that we can look at the past and say, okay, so that's how it was then. Not necessarily okay, not necessarily the way that it should have been, but rather than losing the plot, rather than calling this totalitarian censorship and condemning the authors and the publishers and everyone who's doing it, which is understandable and probably even justifiable, I think instead that we just need to teach our kids that the past is a foreign country. They did things differently there. And what that will probably do then is lead to a deepening of the appreciation of the world that we live in. When people look back on the world now, I'm sure they're going to say, oh my goodness, what were they doing in 2023? Like, let's go 50, 60, 70 years down the track. I'd say that our 2023 world will probably look fairly quaint and quite strange to our kids. I just don't think that we need to be as judgy as we're being about the past. Let's just accept that the past was what it was, and now we're trying to do better. Use it as a teaching tool.
And that's how I see it. If we were to take this in a really, I guess, personal and practical point of view and look back at my childhood, for all intents and purposes, that's my children's history right there. There is so much of that childhood that I would love to rewrite, that I wish never happened, or that was painful and damaging. And yet for me to turn around and pretend like it never happened, that's actually where the real damage takes place. Not that it happened, but that I try to pretend that it didn't.
I feel like there's a quote out there somewhere where somebody said, if we don't remember history and learn from it, we're bound to repeat the mistakes of the past.
Yeah. Like so much of my childhood has helped me develop and become the person I am today for the better.
Yeah.
Because I have learned from those experiences the things that I don't want in my life moving forward.
And I think there's one other thing that's probably worth mentioning, and that is, as you read these books, read the old versions, read the ones that have got the forbidden grossness in them, the words that apparently we don't use anymore. I think that we can have a conversation with the kids and say, well, what do you think? How does that feel? Where do you sit with this? Because they can enjoy the fantasy of it, but they can also then internalize the morality that they've been raised with and highlight, well, obviously this is a fun book and I'm laughing at Matilda on the screen, or I'm laughing at James and the Giant Peach or the twits in the book, but I would never say that to somebody. I would never behave like that. That's obviously what's happening in the story.
I was just thinking about some of the other books that we've read with the kids over the years, and you go back to those early fairy tales and they were morbid.
Yeah.
You know, the kids reading The Little Mermaid, thinking they were reading this beautiful fairy tale because that's what they've grown up with.
Yep.
Going back a century and a half and reading Hans Christian Andersen's version of, which was obviously the very first version of it, was just devastating to our girls.
Yep.
But would I want them to rewrite it? No, because it gives us just so much insight.
But that's what Disney's done, though. And you can put Disney Channel on now and watch any of the old shows, and oh my goodness, like there's disclaimers in the warnings, and they've actually edited some of them as well and removed content because it has depictions that are deemed offensive now. But the world was different. I love that meme, and we do need to end this podcast, but I'd love to finish it with two things. First of all, there's that meme. I don't know if you've seen it. There's this guy, he's wearing a denim jacket with like a fleecy collared lining. He's got the long hair and he's walking through a doorway, and he's being a different person for each era of the last few decades. So the first one's born 1970. He walks through the doorway, his shoulder hits the door, and he looks at the door like, oh.
Yeah.
Then 1980, he kind of looks at it and says something to the door. 1990, he hits it, says something to the door, and then rolls his eyes as he walks away. But then we get to the one who's born in 2000. He hits the door and he falls to the ground with huge acting, and then he pulls out the phone and takes a photo of himself in all this pain so that everyone can, there's that performative aspect to it. And I just think there's so much going on here that's performative, so much of it that's over the top. Obviously, people are really upset about it. Salman Rushdie, who is one of the world's most prolific and well-known authors, said this: Roald Dahl was no angel, but this is absurd censorship. Puffin Books and the Dahl estate should be ashamed. Really strong words from a lot of people who are very upset about Roald Dahl. Well, he's dead, but the books being changed and the meanings of the books being changed.
Well, I think that this weekend I plan on going and buying me a few copies of a few books just to be sure that history is preserved.
Yeah. We hope this has given you some food for thought. We hope that if you've got some Roald Dahl books, even if you don't like them, like me, I mean, I really don't like them. I'm looking on our bookshelf now. I can see 3 of them from where we are. Pull a book out, read it to the kids, and have the conversation about how the past is a different country. They do things differently there. The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there. And if you've got any feedback on what we've had to say about this one, let us know. Podcasts at happyfamilies.com.au. That's podcasts with an S. The podcast, as always, is produced by Justin Rulon from Bridge Media. Craig Bruce is our executive producer. Let's wrap this up with one really important idea, Kylie. Regardless of what you think about what we've said, read to your kids. Read to your kids. Make sure your kids are involved in books. Make sure that they're getting the information. Make sure they're reading themselves. Make sure the kids see you reading. Ultimately, I think people care so much about this because people care about books, because we know that books inform, books teach, books help. Read to your kids this weekend. That's the take-home message.